Welcome everyone to a webinar entitled Treating Human Embryos as Human Patients, the Magisterial and Medical FAQs, with presenters Dr. Elizabeth Rex and Dr. George Machascu, and Q&A moderator Francis Etheridge. My name is Sebastian Mahfood, and I am the director of ITEST. The Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, ITEST, is an association of theologians, scientists, and others committed to a Catholic worldview in which faith and science collaborate in exploring the truth. ITEST explores truth theologically in the wisdom traditions of the human community and in the data studied in the sciences. ITEST's mission is to foster and disseminate the Catholic position that science and faith in God are complementary paths to human fulfillment. Before I introduce our first presenter, Father Vincent Uke, retired priest of the Diocese of Trenton, New Jersey, will offer our opening prayer. Father Uke?
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, on the solemnity of the birth of John the Baptist and the first anniversary of the declaration of abortion as not a constitutional right, we pray for the gentleness of John the Baptist towards repentant sinners and the firmness against those who defy natural reason. Help us to find solutions to all left in suspended animation, frozen in time, with gifts intended by God for this world. Help us to find better ways to deal with infertility. Allow married couples to bear their crosses until sources of infertility can be found and treated in accordance with God's gift of co-creation. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Thank you, Father Uke. And now I'm delighted to introduce our first presenter. Dr. Elizabeth Rex is the president of the Children First Foundation, a charitable and educational organization dedicated to promoting adoption as a positive and loving choice for unwanted unborn children, including unwanted frozen embryos. Dr. Rex has taught bioethics at Holy Apostles College and Seminary and is currently an adjunct professor of Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart University. Dr. Rex has spoken at major conferences and is a frequent contributor to the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly regarding the moral arguments in the embryo adoption debate. Dr. Rex's presentation is entitled The Magisterial FAQs regarding the ethical treatment and the legal protection of human embryos who are human beings. Dr. Rex, take it away.
Thank you and welcome everyone. I am going to share my screen and begin my presentation. And I'm very grateful to ITEST. This is my second webinar with you. You're doing outstanding work in service of the church. So I would like to begin my presentation with a very brief but important description of the miracle of life as it magnificently occurs at the first instant of conception, when a tiny human embryo is instantly co-created by God and his or her parents. This is the way that the Blessed Virgin Mary was conceived at her Immaculate Conception, full of grace. It is also the way each one of us was conceived. Since there are now over 1 million frozen human embryos that are languishing in cryopreservation, we'll briefly discuss the loving option of adoption for abandoned snowflake embryonic children, as they're called. We will then discuss the most important frequently asked questions regarding the teachings of the Catholic Church in Donum Vitae, Dignitas Personae, and the Catechism of the Catholic Church that magisterially define and defend the ethical treatment of human beings from the first moment of their conception. These major magisterial documents also call for the intervention of political authorities and legislators to establish civil laws that ensure the legal protection of human beings, even at the embryonic stage. This is in Donum Vitae. My presentation will conclude with a brief review of important international and national laws that have already been legislatively enacted to provide the legal protection of embryos as human beings who must be treated as human persons and human patients. So here's the miracle of life from ovulation to implantation. The oocyte is fertilized by the sperm on day 1. These 2 pronuclei, those are 2 pronucleus, one from the father's sperm, one from the mother's oocyte on day 1. This is a zygote. This is the earliest embryo. On day 2, the embryo now, a unique human being, never to be repeated ever again, has its first cleavage. And now you have the nucleus has been consolidated. And on day 2, it can actually divide into 4 cells. By day 5, it is now called a morula. And by day 6, it's called a blastocyst. So as you can see, within the week, all of this has been going on, and it is now ready to implant. So this is what we call an embryo. It's all of these different very early stages from ovulation to pre-implantation. The embryo has not implanted yet. And so the frozen embryos are at some stage along the line. There are even pronuclear embryos that have been frozen at that day 1 stage. So here is the big picture. So as you can see in the middle of your screen, there's the ovary where the little oocytes, the little eggs, start to mature. It's very complicated. It's very complex. And eventually, one of these little eggs, there's ovulation, and the oocyte is released. And that is where fertilization happens. You can see the sperm that has fertilized the egg, and now fertilization has happened. It happens in a second. And from this moment on, it is now a unique human being. And it's not well known that sperms are either X sperms or Y sperm. And the X sperm will join with the X in the woman's egg, and XX means it's going to be a female. If it's a Y sperm, it'll join with the X egg, and it will be a male. So the gender is established at fertilization. It's either an X sperm or a Y sperm, and it'll either be a boy or a girl from the very first instant. The fertilized egg is called the zygote, as you can see. The 2 little pronuclei, that's a fertilized egg, but that's called a zygote. It's not an egg anymore. It's a zygote. It's an embryo. So then you have the first cleavage by day 2 at the 2-cell stage. Then by day 3 or 4, it's the 4-cell stage. Then it goes on to the 8-cell uncompacted morula stage. By day 4, it is now an 8-cell compacted morula. And by day 5, we have the early blastocyst. By day 6, we have the late stage blastocyst beginning to hatch. And by day 8, we have the implantation of the blastocyst in the uterus, in the womb. So here's a real picture. And I'd like to say that the human zygote, the human being, Mary, looked like this at her Immaculate Conception, just hours after the first instant in which she was immaculately conceived. So she has a mother and a father. And you can see the pronucleus, the 2 pronuclei, one from her father, and it was an X sperm, and the X gene from her mother's egg. And they're both equal in size at this point. You can see them very clearly. And this, I like to say, is what Jesus looked like when Mary was on her way to visit her cousin Elizabeth. It happened immediately. She went with haste to the mountainside. So Jesus may have been in Mary's fallopian tube when she greeted Elizabeth with St. John as a fetus. But this is what Jesus looked like. He's fully human, just like you and me. So this is pretty amazing. And what we do to the least of my brethren, we do to Jesus, who was once an embryo. So the Vatican has not ruled out the practice of embryo adoption. I want to bring this up at the beginning. At the Vatican press conference on December 12th, the president of the Pontifical Academy for Life, Archbishop Rino Fisichella, told the Catholic News Service that, quote, the discussion is still open on the matter of embryo adoption, and specifically stated that, quote, the Vatican did not rule out the practice. And so here's what it looks like. Are frozen embryos children? Do frozen embryos need ethical health care? Yes. Daniel and Abigail Buckley embracing their twins, Liliana and Elliot, who were frozen embryos for 20 years. They were born on June 19th last year. Big sister Emma was frozen for 24 years. And baby sister Molly was frozen for 27 years. And here are the two sisters hugging each other. They're so happy to have each other. The father, Ben, was sterile due to cystic fibrosis. And they considered embryo adoption and adopted frozen embryos. It was a mutual agreement between the placing family and the receiving family, adopted family. So they can still have contact with their natural parents, who there may be other siblings from the previous ones who did IVF. Ben and Tina did not do IVF. They adopted their spare embryos and are giving them birth. And this is the most recent historic birth. The Ridgway family went and wanted the oldest frozen embryos they could find. They already had 4 children, but they wanted to adopt the children that needed a family the most, the ones that had been frozen the longest. And they adopted 3 embryos. You can see them there. And 9 months later, Lydia and Timothy were born. They had been frozen for 30 years. This was back just in November, I believe it was, a few months ago. Here they are with their family. They wanted to have a large family. And it's really beautiful. And here is Hannah Strigi. Anna Strigi was the world's first adopted frozen embryo with her mother, Marlene, and their father, John, who wrote a book. And I have this book, I'm promoting this book, A Snowflake Named Hannah, and Ethics, Faith, and the First Adoption of a Frozen Embryo. And believe it or not, when she was, I forget how old she is there, about maybe 7. That's when President Bush, remember the big debate, whether there should be taxpayer funding for embryonic stem cell research. Well, Bush was a big supporter of adoption. And he knew that embryos were being adopted. And he put out a call. Could any snowflake families and children make it to the White House? And they had very little advance notice because he was going to veto the embryonic stem cell research bill. And many families showed up with their children, including Marlene and their daughter, Hannah, who was the very first one, snowflake number 1. And there they are. He said, this is why I vetoed the embryonic stem cell research bill, because of embryo adoption. They are children. And it's very powerful what happened. So I wanted to mention the Nuremberg Code, because this is the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg Code. It was 2 months before August 20th, on June 24th, as Father Vincent has mentioned, the Supreme Court finally overturned Roe v. Wade, and today, June 24th, millions of Americans all across the nation are celebrating the first anniversary of Dobbs as the National Celebration of Life Day. And back in 1997, on the 50th anniversary of the Nuremberg Code, a Dr. Evelyn Schuster, who's a medical ethicist, published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine titled 50 Years Later, The Significance of the Nuremberg Code. So now it's 75 years later. And Dr. Schuster summarized the code's historical significance with these words. The Nuremberg Code is the most important document in the history of ethics of medical research. The code was formulated 50 years ago in August 1947 in Nuremberg, Germany by American judges sitting in judgment of Nazi doctors accused of conducting murderous and torturous human experiments in the concentration camps. It served as a blueprint for today's principles that ensure the rights of subjects in medical research. By insisting that medical investigators alone cannot set the rules for ethical conduct of research, even when guided by beneficence and Hippocratic ethics, and by adopting a human rights perspective that acknowledges the centrality of informed consent and the right of the subject to withdraw, the Nuremberg Code has changed forever the way physicians and the public view the proper conduct of medical research on human subjects. 50 years after Nuremberg, we recognize the human rights legacy of the Nuremberg Code and are better able to face the critical challenge of applying the code in its entirety and enforcing its human rights provisions. Dr. Schuster's article was published in November of 1997, roughly 20 years after the birth of Louise Joy Brown, the world's first test tube baby, IVF baby, who was born in July of 1978. And 10 years after the Vatican's promulgation of Donum Vitae in 1987, which condemned IVF and other assisted reproductive techniques. Unfortunately, no mention whatsoever was made in her article regarding the unbridled creation and destruction of countless IVF human embryos that were being deliberately manufactured not to conceive and to give birth to a child, but specifically for scientific research and experimentation. The birth of the first IVF baby, Louise Joy Brown, in July of 1978, made front-page headline news around the world and immediately raised numerous legal and ethical questions regarding the creation of IVF human embryos for scientific research and experimentation purposes. Bioethicists and theologians worldwide began discussing the ethics of IVF and the moral status of the human embryo. In 1979, the Ethics Advisory Board of the then Department of Health, Education, and Welfare of the United States published a document recommending a 14-day limit to the growth of a human embryo in vitro. It became known as the 14-day rule, and several countries pledged to prohibit in vitro experimentation on human embryos beyond 14 days. This rule requires that all human embryos created for research must be destroyed after 14 days. And I quote Francis Etheridge's book, Conception. Providentially, just 3 months after the birth of the first IVF baby in July 1978, Cardinal Karol Józef Wojtyła was elected as Pope John Paul II on October 22, 1978. 9 years later, in 1987, the Pope promulgated the Instruction Donum Vitae that was written to define and address the immorality of artificial fertilization and added important new bioethical standards regarding the ethical treatment and health care of all human embryos. For example, Donum Vitae prohibits IVF and other assisted reproductive techniques, but it also declares as licit and even desirable any therapeutic medical procedure to heal and save the lives of human embryos. So let us briefly examine several key passages in Donum Vitae that explicitly deal with the ethical health care of human embryos and that are of such importance that they are also cited in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The first key passage can be found in the Catechism, number 2274, and it cites Donum Vitae 1.2. Quote, since it must be treated from conception as a person, the embryo must be defended in its integrity, cared for, and healed as far as possible, like any other human being. The second key passage can be found in 2275, and it cites Donum Vitae 1.3. It begins by asking the following question. Are therapeutic procedures carried out on the human embryo licit? Quote, as with all medical interventions on patients, one must uphold as licit procedures carried out on the human embryo, which respect the life and integrity of the embryo and do not involve disproportionate risks for it, but are directed towards its healing, the improvement of its condition of health, or its individual survival. A third key passage can be found in 2276, and it cites Donum Vitae 1.4. And it begins by asking the following question. How is one to morally evaluate research and experimentation on human embryos and fetuses? And it states what is unacceptable experimentation. Quote, no objective, even though noble in itself, such as foreseeable advantage in science, to other human beings, or to society, can in any way justify experimentation on living human embryos or fetuses. And in the footnote, it is even stronger. Quote, I condemn in the most explicit and formal way experimental manipulations of the human embryo, since the human being from conception to death cannot be exploited for any purpose whatsoever. That was John Paul II in an address to the meeting of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, October 23rd, 1982. Then Donum Vitae 1.4 states what is acceptable experimentation. Quote, in the case of experimentation that is clearly therapeutic, namely where it is a matter of experimental forms of therapy used for the benefit of the embryo itself in a final attempt to save its life, and in the absence of other reliable forms of therapy, recourse to drugs or procedures not yet fully tested can be licit. So on December 12th, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith publicly released the instruction Dignitas Personae on certain bioethical questions. At this time, so many years after Donum Vitae, there were hundreds of thousands of spare frozen embryos now in existence in the world. And Dignitas Personae states, quote, the majority of embryos that are not used remain orphans. Their parents do not ask for them. And at times, all trace of the parents is lost. This is why there are thousands upon thousands of frozen embryos in almost all countries where in vitro fertilization takes place. Dignitas Personae 19 then asks, with regard to the large number of frozen embryos already in existence, the question becomes what to do with them. Some of those who pose this question do not grasp its ethical nature, motivated as they are by laws in some countries, like England, that require cryopreservation centers to empty their storage tanks periodically. Others, however, are aware that a grave injustice has been perpetuated and wonder how best to respond to the duty of resolving it. We will review frequently asked questions about this problem and provide magisterial quotes to answer them. Are all embryos produced in vitro exposed to an absurd fate? No. Only, quote, those embryos which are not transferred into the body of the mother and are called spare are exposed to an absurd fate. Should human embryos obtained in vitro be exposed to death? No. It is, quote, not in conformity with the moral law, deliberately to expose to death human embryos obtained in vitro? Is it licit to freeze embryos to preserve their lives? No. The freezing, quote, the freezing of embryos, even when carried out in order to preserve the life of the embryo, cryopreservation, constitutes an offense against the respect due to human beings by exposing them to grave risks of death or harm to their physical integrity. And the italics is in the original. Are there other reasons why cryopreservation of embryos constitutes an offense? Yes. In addition, cryopreservation, quote, constitutes an offense against the respect due to human beings because it deprives them, at least temporarily, of maternal shelter and gestation. Depriving them of maternal shelter and gestation, thus placing them in a situation in which further offenses and manipulation are possible. That's in both Donum Vitae and Dignitas Personae, both. So should human embryos be kept in permanent cryopreservation? No. Embryos should not be kept in permanent cryopreservation for 3 magisterial reasons. It exposes them to grave risks of death and harm to their physical integrity. It deprives them of maternal shelter and gestation. It places them, quote, in a situation in which further offenses and manipulations are possible. Can parents donate their frozen embryos to clinical experimentation? No. No objective, so quote, even though noble in itself, such as a foreseeable advantage to science, to other human beings, or to society, can in any way justify experimentation on living human embryos or fetuses, whether viable or not, either inside or outside the mother's womb. The informed consent ordinarily required for clinical experimentation on adults cannot be granted by the parents. Donum Vitae 1:4. May parents freely choose to thaw and let their frozen unborn children die? No. Parents, quote, may not freely dispose of the physical integrity or life of the unborn child. Donum Vitae 1:4. Would, quote, the gestation of human embryos in the uterus of animals, or the hypothesis or project of constructing artificial uteruses, i.e. artificial womb, for the human embryo be licit? No. These procedures are contrary to the human dignity proper to the embryos, Donum Vitae 1:6, and emphasis in the original. No artificial wombs. You don't stick a baby in a machine to gestate it when there's a maternal womb. The mothers, the biological mothers, or an adoptive mother is a possibility. Are therapeutic procedures carried out on the human embryo licit? Yes. Quote, as with all medical interventions on patients, one must uphold as licit procedures carried out on the human embryo and do not involve disproportionate risks for it, but are directed towards its healing, the improvement of its health, condition of health, or its individual survival. Emphasis in the original. Is it licit, therefore, to transfer an embryo obtained in vitro, who is a human being and a patient, into the body of the mother as a medical intervention that is directed toward the individual survival of the human embryo? Yes. As stated in Donum Vitae 1:3, as with all medical interventions on patients, one must uphold as licit procedures carried out on the human embryo that are directed towards its individual survival for maternal shelter and gestation. Is it therefore also licit to use therapeutic procedures to save frozen human embryos who are human beings and patients to heal and improve their conditions of health? Yes. As stated above, just the same quote over and over again is there. I'll go to the next question. Can parents give their informed consent to whatever the type of medical, surgical, or other therapy needed to heal their embryonic children? Yes. Whatever the type, quote, whatever the type of medical, surgical, or other therapy, including embryo transfer, the free and informed consent of the parents is required according to the deontological rules followed in the case of children. Donum Vitae 1.3. Does homologous in vitro fertilization, which means between husband and wife, share the same ethical negativity found in extra-conjugal procreation, not with husband and wife? No. Certainly, homologous between husband and wife, IVF, fertilization is not marked by all the ethical negativity found in extra-conjugal procreation, not between husband and wife. The family and marriage continue to constitute the setting for the birth and upbringing of the children. Nevertheless, the Church remains opposed from the moral point of view to homologous in vitro fertilization. So the Church condemns in vitro fertilization, but among husband and wife, it's less reprehensible than between heterologous in vitro fertilization, where there's donor sperm or donor eggs or a surrogate uterus that violate marriage, violate the spouses, and violate the child. It's the fertilization that is not among husband and wife that is more serious. So, but it's interesting that here, Donum Vitae does say the child will be brought up in the family and marriage. So, it's very interesting. Should a child whose human conception was achieved with IVF and ET be accepted and brought up? Yes. Here's the quote. Although the manner in which human conception is achieved with IVF and ET cannot be approved, every child which comes into the world must in any case be accepted as a living gift of the divine goodness and must be brought up with love. End of quote. Does Dignitas Personae refer to abandoned cryopreserved embryos as orphans? Yes. The majority of embryos that are not used remain orphans. Their parents do not ask for them, and at times all trace of their parents is lost. This is why there are thousands upon thousands of frozen embryos in almost all countries where in vitro fertilization takes place. Just reading it again, Dignitas Personae 18. Does Donum Vitae recommend that infertile couples consider adoption? And does Dignitas Personae praise the intention of prenatal adoption for frozen embryos? Yes. Donum Vitae teaches, quote, physical sterility, in fact, can be for spouses the occasion for other important services in the life of a person, including an embryo who's a person. For example, adoption. That's Donum Vitae 2b8. And Dignitas Personae, which magisterially confirms Donum Vitae, and the principles and moral evaluations which it expresses, further calls, quote, the proposal of prenatal adoption as praiseworthy with regard to the intention of respecting and defending human life. Is prenatal adoption essentially different from artificial heterologous fertilization and from surrogate motherhood? Yes. Prenatal adoption involves the process of licitly and legally adopting one or more frozen human embryos as one's own legally adopted children. Therefore, prenatal adoption is essentially different from artificial fertilization, heterologous fertilization, IVF. Completely different, which involves illicit techniques used to obtain a human conception. It would be like a child conceived in adultery or in rape or in incest or in fornication. The child is innocent. The sin has been done. IVF is sinful, but now it needs to be gestated, given birth, loved, or placed for adoption. Those are the two options. It's life for the child. It has a right to life. Prenatal adoption is also essentially different from surrogate motherhood, which involves the illicit agreement with a woman who is paid to carry a pregnancy with a pledge, and this is a quote from Donum Vitae, pregnancy with a pledge to surrender the child once it is born. Again, it's completely different from adoption. Are Donum Vitae and Dignitas Personae dedicated to defending the gift of human life and the dignity of the human person from the first moment of conception? Yes. Quote, in virtue of the Church's doctrinal and pastoral mission, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has felt obliged to reiterate both the dignity and the fundamental and inalienable rights of every human being, though including those in the initial stages of their existence, and to state explicitly the need for protection and respect, which this dignity requires of everyone. The fulfillment of this duty implies courageous opposition to all those practices which result in grave and unjust discrimination against unborn human beings who have the dignity of a person created like others in the image of God. That's in Dignitas Personae's conclusion. Do both instructions condemn artificial reproductive techniques and praise adoption? Yes. Both instructions condemn all forms of artificial reproductive techniques. Yes. Both instructions condemn cryopreservation of human embryos because it kills them and harms their physical integrity and because it deprives them even temporarily of maternal reception and gestation. And yes, both instructions magisterially defend the use of therapeutic procedures to heal and save the lives of human embryos. And yes, both instructions praise and promote adoption. We just hope the Church will praise and promote prenatal adoption. So Dignitas Personae asks the question, what to do with them? There is a clear and unambiguous answer in Donum Vitae 2b5, which was also confirmed in Dignitas Personae. Quote, we've read it before, but this is what I think is the solution. Although the manner in which human conception is achieved with IVF and ET cannot be approved, every child which comes into the world must, in any case, be accepted as a living gift of the divine goodness and must be brought up with love. So this brings us to international bylaws. And 2270 in the Catechism of the Catholic Church states, quote, human life must be respected and protected absolutely from the moment of conception. From the first moment of his existence, a human being must be recognized as having the rights of a person, among which is the inviolable right of every innocent human being to life. Even our Declaration of Independence recognized the right to life as our first God-given unalienable right. 2271 in the Catechism of the Catholic Church provides historical evidence of this perennial church teaching. Quote, since the first century, the Church has affirmed the moral evil of every procured abortion. This teaching has not changed and remains unchangeable. Direct abortion, that is to say, abortion willed either as an end or as a means, is gravely contrary to the moral law. And look at this from the Didache, Tertullian, quote, you shall not kill the embryo by abortion and shall not cause the newborn to perish. This is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. 2273 clearly and magisterially recommends legislation to protect the inalienable right of every human individual, stating, the inalienable right to life of every innocent human individual is a constitutive element of civil society and its legislation. Quote, the inalienable rights of the person must be recognized and respected by civil society and the political authority. These human rights depend neither on single individuals nor on parents, nor do they represent a concession made by society and the state. They belong to human nature and are inherent in the person by virtue of the creative act from which the person took his origin, which is God and the natural parents. 2273. The moment a positive law deprives a category of human beings the protection which civil legislation ought to accord them, the state is denying the equality of all before the law. When the state does not place its power at the service of the rights of each citizen, and in particular of the more vulnerable, the very foundations of a state based on law are undermined. And as a consequence of the respect and protection which must be ensured for the unborn child from the moment of conception, the law must provide appropriate penal sanctions for every deliberate violation of the child's right. Donum Vitae 3. With my remaining time, I will now briefly comment on 2 international bylaws and other state laws that protect human embryos. Please be sure to read them on the ITEST webinar page, and if possible, get them into the hands of pro-life legislators in your own home state who can propose similar bills in all 50 states. These are model legislation. Germany's Embryo Protection Act, 1990, 3 years after Donum Vitae, they passed a law to protect the lives of human embryos. It's just going to be brief little snippets, okay? But for example, Section 1 talks about the improper use of reproduction technology. Anyone will be punished with up to 3 years imprisonment or a fine who transfers into a woman an unfertilized egg produced by another woman. 2, attempts to fertilize artificially an egg cell for any purpose other than bringing about a pregnancy of the woman from whom the egg cell was originated. So no creation of embryos for experimentation. 3, attempts within one treatment cycle to transfer more than 3 embryos into a woman. Attempts by gamete intrafallopian transfer to fertilize more than 3 eggs cells with one treatment. That would be placing 3 eggs and doing artificial insemination. That's against the law in Germany. More than 3, because then you would have to probably abort 1 or more if they implant. Attempts to fertilize more egg cells from a woman than may be transferred to her within one treatment cycle. 6, removes an embryo from a woman before completion of implantation in the uterus in order to transfer it to another woman or to use it for another purpose not serving its preservation. Or 7, attempts to carry out an artificial fertilization of a woman who is prepared to give up her child permanently after birth, surrogate mother, or to transfer a human embryo into her. This is prohibited by law in Germany. Likewise, anyone will be punished who, 1, brings about artificially the penetration of a human egg cell by a human sperm. 2, transfers a human sperm cell into a human egg cell artificially without intending to bring about a pregnancy in the woman from whom the egg cell originated. Then Section 2 of this Embryo Protection Act talks about the improper use of human embryos. Anyone who disposes of or hands over or acquires or uses for a purpose not serving its preservation a human embryo produced outside the body or removed from a woman before the completion of implantation in the uterus will be punished with imprisonment up to 3 years or a fine. Likewise, anyone will be punished who causes a human embryo to develop further outside the body for any purpose other than the bringing about of a pregnancy. They're thinking about the life of the embryo. Any attempt is punishable. These are just other sections. Forbidden sex selection, no chimeras or hybrids, no cloning. This is a great law. Entry into force was January 1st, 1991. Then Italy. Italy in 2004 passed Law 40 and is called the Medically Assisted Reproductive Law. And again, it limits IVF. There was a lot of controversy over this law, but the Vatican ended up defending it when it was challenged. They wanted to overthrow the law. Once it got passed, they wanted to overthrow it because it was so restrictive. It basically shut down IVF and totally shut down cryopreservation. And so to defend it from being overturned, the Vatican supported it. So here are just general principles. Article 1, with the aim of facilitating the solution of reproductive problems consequent to human sterility and infertility, it is permitted to utilize medically assisted procreation under the conditions and according to modalities prescribed in the present law that ensures the rights of everyone involved, including the one to be conceived. Resorting to medically assisted procreation is only permitted when there are no other therapeutically effective means to remove the causes of sterility or infertility. It is permitted to utilize techniques of medically assisted procreation only when the impossibility to otherwise remove the impediments to procreation has been established. And in any way, this utilization is limited to cases of unexplained sterility and infertility documented through a medical act. Whereas what is established by Article 4, subsection 1 remains valid, access to medically assisted procreation is granted to couples made up of persons of different sex, having reached the age of maturity, married or living together, of potentially fertile age, and both living. No sperm from a deceased spouse or eggs from a deceased wife. The juridical status of the newborn. Those born out of the application of techniques for medically assisted procreation possess the status of legitimate children or of recognized children of the couple. And then the prohibition to disavow paternity and anonymity of the mother. In the event of an application of heterologous techniques in violation of the prohibition, the gamete donor does not, either the sperm donor or the egg donor, does not acquire any juridical parental relation with the newborn and cannot request to exercise upon him or her any right or be subject to obligation. Any experiment on every human embryo is prohibited. Embryo cryopreservation and suppression are forbidden. And now we have a couple of national bio laws that I'd like to point out quickly. You can find the links on the webinar page, ITEST. The Louisiana Health Law, Chapter 3, Human Embryos, that in 1986 established the legal status of an IVF human embryo as a juridical person. That should be passed in every state. We can look at the Louisiana Health Law and do the same in pro-life states. We establish the legal status of an IVF human embryo, usually a frozen embryo, as a juridical person, period. And Georgia went even further. Georgia's Embryo Adoption Act, titled the Option of Adoption Act, states that, quote, a legal embryo custodian, meaning either the mother or the father, whoever has the frozen embryos, may relinquish all rights and responsibilities for an embryo to a recipient intended to parent prior to embryo transfer. So you adopt the embryo before you transfer it to the womb of the adopted mother or the adoptive couple that have adopted this baby before it's transferred. And so they are now legally the parents. Last but certainly not least, please read the Embryo Adoption Act, carefully prepared by Americans United for Life, AUL, for use as model legislation in all 50 states. It's also on the ITEST website. In its introduction, AUL makes two important statements. One, quote, in compliance with experts' view that embryo donations and transfers should be governed by adoption, not property law, this model bill creates procedures to ensure that the adoptive parents are considered the legal parents of the human embryo. They're recommending adoption, not donation of property, adoption of a child. Two, in the context of embryo adoption, one key issue that must be specifically addressed is the timing of the relinquishment or the surrender of the rights of the genetic parents. They cease to be the parents. In context of the adoption of an infant, in my case, we adopted two infants, surrender of rights is typically delayed until a certain period of time, 24 hours or 72 hours after the genetic mother gives birth. And usually in a court, you have to go to court to terminate their rights and to establish our rights. In the context of embryo adoption, however, when the mother who commissioned the creation of the child does not carry the child, relinquishments of rights should take place before embryo transfer. So now it's their children and they are transferring them to the mother's womb. It is not well known that in full accordance with the Nuremberg Code and the magisterial teachings of the Catholic Church, 2 World War II allied enemy nations have passed strict legislation banning all non-therapeutic experimentation on human embryos, namely Germany in 1990 with its embryo protection law and Italy in 2004 with its medically assisted reproductive law that limits and regulates IVF. These international bio-laws provide model legislation that have banned cryopreservation and all therapeutic experimentation on human embryos. On its 75th anniversary, the Nuremberg Code must be updated to equally defend the lives of human embryos from the same heinous crimes that the code rightly condemns as human rights violations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. X, for your excellent presentation. And now I'm pleased to introduce our second presenter, Dr. George Machescu. Dr. Machescu is a founder and president of the St. Padre Pio Institute School of Osteopathic Medicine, proposed, which will be co-located on the campus of Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. Dr. Machescu is a thought leader in medical education and has developed 4 operating osteopathic medical colleges and is in the process of developing 4 more. A practicing cardiac anesthesiologist, Dr. Machescu is a graduate of the Kansas City College of Osteopathic Medicine and completed his residency and fellowships in pediatric cardiothoracic anesthesiology at the Yale University School of Medicine. Dr. Machescu's presentation is entitled The Medical FAQs Regarding the Ethical and Therapeutic Healthcare of Human Embryos Who Are Human Patients. Dr. Machescu, take it away.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here this early Saturday morning. I need to get my screen up. And away we go. Very good. Yes, thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit more today about IVF specifically. And IVF is one of those fields that greatly took off in the United States, really without a lot of oversight or regulation. And that it continues. And part of the reason for that is that a lot of IVF takes place in medical offices, not in hospitals, right? Hospitals are very, very regulated, very closely monitored. Medical offices, not so much. So that has been some of the reason that this has run away ethically. And it's states don't particularly regulate medical offices that closely. Some states, worse than others. Mandatory disclaimers, as Sebastian said, I am founder of a new proposed developing medical school to be co-located on the campus of Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. A very traditional Catholic medical school, the only one in the world that will be under ex corde ecclesiae. Obviously, in the Catholic Church, as Dr. Elizabeth Rex so well described, IVF is illicit and a sin under the principles of the Catholic Church. But I will try to put that on a shelf for now and just talk about the secular medical aspects of this and the way secular society would look at it. I'm always a little reluctant to say, well, something's bad just because the church says it's bad, right? It's very easy to attack arguments like that. There should be a humanistic or ethical basis just beyond, well, we say it's bad because, right? There has to be logic and framework behind that. So IVF was first studied in animals in the 1930s. So this has been around for a long, long time. And, in very basic terms, it's simply egg cells, sperm cells being fertilized outside the body. Embryos are created and then implanted into the uterus. So not on its surface a terribly complicated technology, but obviously, like anything, it has its nuances. So in the process, how does this happen? We all talked about IVF, and I just wanted to go back up a little bit and just in a very simple way explain just what happens. So what happens is a woman receives hormones, medications to stimulate ovulation, superovulation it's called. Normally, one egg cell is released per month, but the IVF practitioners want to get a lot of egg cells. So they produce a lot of egg cells through this superovulation stimulation. And then the eggs are retrieved, usually under moderate sedation, local anesthesia. So follicular aspiration, somebody goes in with an instrument and retrieves the ovulating cell. And there's two ways then that the cells are fertilized. Traditionally older technologies, simply the eggs and sperms were mixed together under laboratory conditions. I think that that we all use the wastebasket term test tube baby for that. And you think about it, it's very, very simple, right? You mix sperm and egg together and just wait for lack of a better term, nature to take its course. There's a slightly lower incidence of anomalies with that and birth defects, but it's also less successful. Ovulation or fertilization occurs probably in 46, 50% of attempts with that. A more advanced and newer technology has a higher rate of fertilization, and that's the intracytoplasmic cytoplasmic sperm injection, where a sperm cell is injected directly into an egg cell. And you see that on the picture there on the screen. The success rate is much higher with that, right? Because you're not waiting for sperm and egg to find each other in a petri dish. You're directly injecting the sperm into an egg cell and causing fertilization to occur. And that, again, happens successfully 75 to 80%. The time there's a slightly higher rate of birth anomalies with that. It's not an overwhelmingly high rate, but obviously you're sticking a needle into a cell, and there's always the chance to bang up against chromosomes, things like that. So there is a higher rate of anomalies with that, but that is actually becoming a preferred technique with IVF clinics because, well, people are paying a lot of money for IVF. It costs somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 per cycle, and they want results. So this is a more guaranteed result. So the embryos are then cultured for about 5 days. And again, Dr. Rex very well described the life cycle of the embryo. And right at about 3 to 5 days is also when many of the embryos undergo genetic testing for diagnosis of genetically carried diseases. So embryo transfer typically occurs at 3 to 5 days post-fertilization. And this is also the point where embryos may be cryopreserved. Typically, an IVF clinic will create 5 to 10, 20 embryos, and they can implant multiple embryos trying for implantation or cryopreserve those children, embryos. And there's all these euphemisms that we go through in reproductive medicine, that is a euphemism in of itself. So I always say, well, pick the term that makes you the most comfortable: zygote, embryo, fetus, child, infant. I like, and of course, scientifically, these are defined by various time categories, but in our view, it's simply just time points on a spectrum. But at any rate, 3 to 5 days post-fertilization is when cryopreservation typically happens. So the ethical issues are fairly abundant when you think about it, because we have rushed into this technology of artificially creating humans outside of the human reproductive system. And, well, a couple of things just to begin with. Obviously, these have a high use of medical resources. Requires skilled practitioners, it requires a lot of biomedical equipment, and it requires just a high degree of medical resources. There's always the argument of why are these resources being used for what is essentially a cosmetic procedure. I mean, we don't think of it as cosmetic, I suppose, but I always think of procedures, anything that is completely optional, as cosmetic. So we're using a lot of medical resources. And again, when we're treating children as entitlements, are people entitled to have a child just because they want a child? I may be entitled to have a love seat or a sofa with a paisley pattern because I'm entitled to have that, I suppose, if I can afford it. But should we treat children in that same manner? And when you get a little deeper into this, you can see what happens. So age limits are one of the ethical issues that come up. IVF has been used to create embryos and then implant those embryos into older women. I think the oldest patient in the world with a successful IVF pregnancy was about 75 years old. I mean, does this make sense? There's a lot of ethical debate about what does it mean if you're a 75-year-old mother to an infant, and what does that mean for the raising of the children? Along that same line, one of the largest uses of IVF and legislative proponents of IVF are the same-sex couples. The Secretary of Transportation, pictured here, most prominent in that, where same-sex couples go through an IVF process from obviously a donor, from the sperm or egg, depending on the sexual orientation of the couple, and then have this child either through implantation in the case of women or surrogate in the case of men. I mean, is this something that should be legal? There's a lot of support for same-sex couples in the society, and I think the IVF industry really doesn't put any thought into the ethical ramifications of this. They're simply, if you want a child, we can make you a child, and this is well beyond the scope of our discussion as far as the stability and adaptability of children in same-sex marriages, but this is a large use of IVF. And again, single parents. So if you're a single individual, and you can afford IVF, should you then be able to have a child because it's better than having a puppy or something like that? You can see where that can be an issue. So the problem is that we are treating children as property, and the courts have even used court precedents from the days before slavery was abolished to help adjudicate cases. You see here a picture of Sofia Vergara, Hollywood actress, and her then boyfriend, husband, which whom they created embryos, put the embryos in cryopreservation. And then, of course, as things always happen in Hollywood, or often happen in Hollywood, they became estranged from one another. So today, these embryos are cryopreserved. The father wants the embryos to be gestated and raised. The mother, Ms. Vergara, wants the embryos stored or destroyed. And the court is trying to figure out, well, what happens with this property, as they call it. And really, again, I thought since 1865 in the United States, people couldn't be property. But IVF is a big exception to that. And you see a lot of social storage and social surrogacy going on, particularly in California, where IVF and surrogacy has the lowest rate of regulation in the country. We frequently read of Hollywood couples talking about creating embryos and then storing those embryos and having a surrogate bring those to gestation, or bring an embryo to gestation when the time is appropriate for their Hollywood careers. So this has completely removed the parents, biological parents, from the gestation, pregnancy, and birth cycle. And now you have these children who are gestated, brought to life, and given to the biological parents. And I think Kourtney Kardashian recently had undergone something like that. And she said that, well, this feels so transactional, having done it that way. And I say, well, of course it feels transactional, because that's what it is. And social surrogacy, while outside the topic of our conversation today, is another sort of bold new world in California, especially, where people create embryos and then simply just pay a woman, usually of a middle to lower socioeconomic status, usually in Southern California, where there's a high demographic of migrants. They will pay these women to gestate this infant to term. And that way they don't affect their Hollywood careers by having to have a baby bump or stretch marks and things like that. And you can see where this is just fraught with room for disaster, because again, these are contractual relationships now rather than naturally created and gestated children. And it's always easy to break a contract. Every contract in the world that's valid has an out clause. So there was that issue. And because people want their money's worth, and this is the whole issue with IVF, multiple embryos are created and then cryopreserved. So then what happens, as Dr. Elizabeth Rex has said quite skillfully, what happens with all these excess embryos? They're just sitting in this secular limbo of cryopreservation, they're alive, but they're not allowed to come to life, and they're not dying either. They're not dead. So they just sit until the power runs out, until people quit paying the bills, until what? And it's interesting, you see some of these Hollywood types. There was one woman on one of these semi-reality shows from Hollywood that has these 3 embryos, and she named the embryos, and they brought one to term. Coincidentally, was the male that was brought to term in a culture that values males. The 2 female embryos were allowed to die or discarded. That just should be illegal. But it's acceptable secularly and legally in many jurisdictions. And this is leading to this issue of all these children trapped in liquid nitrogen. And you also see the term bandied about of these children being donated for research. And that's even more, in our view, reprehensible. I mean, if the child was older, right, if it was a 38-week fetus? Or if the child was a 2-year-old, would you donate your child for medical research? I mean, I think everybody feels what the right answer is about that. But when we're talking about 5-day embryos or up to the 15-day limit, 15-day embryos, which lives matter? Our society seems to think those lives just don't matter. But they are human, they're uniquely human, and they're alive. There's no real room for equivocation. The only equivocation, or the only decision is, well, when do humans count? When is it important? And there's no widespread societal agreement on that. The Catholic Church is obviously very clear that all humans are equally worthy from the moment of fertilization or conception until natural death. But our secular society is far, far from that. And even a lot of, quote, casual Catholics are far from that. A lot of debate also goes on about PGD, or pre-gestational diagnosis. So now we've created embryos, and they can go in and decide which ones are worthy of being brought to gestation. If they have genetic diseases, hereditary diseases, they may be just eliminated, exterminated. Pick a euphemism. There are some countries that advocate pre-gestational diagnosis as a nationalist policy for healthy population. Even in 2023, this is not 1939, where kind of the golden era of eugenics goes on. And while we're talking about this in terms of IVF, we know that genetic diagnosis goes on all the time. And we also know that being an unborn child with a genetic anomaly such as Down syndrome is an extraordinarily dangerous place to be in. Iceland has bragged that they've eliminated Down syndrome in their country. And they haven't really. They've eliminated people with Down syndrome. They almost universally do prenatal testing and simply exterminate every child with Down syndrome. And while we like to beat up on Iceland because they are the world's leader in extermination of children with Down syndrome, other countries are not very far behind, including the United States. So, again, this is an extremely dangerous area to be treading in. It's only a matter of steps between Down syndrome and then other less desirable genetic characteristics. And we saw what happened with that in the 1930s and 40s. So now we're just maybe doing eugenics of a more acceptable or different nature. But ultimately, the issue is these millions of children in a technological limbo. We have this technology to do this. We've created a lot of millions of humans that are sitting in liquid nitrogen. And this treats human life as a commodity. And in any frame of reference, whether it's secular, non-secular, that should be disturbing to people. But I think most people go right to step 4, not considering that they are creating human lives and children, embryos, for cryopreservation. I mean, I see some concern about that in some of the other studies that have recently come out. And people give lip service to ethical concerns. But a lot of times, what's ethical for physicians is what's legal. And us, particularly in the IVF industry, there's not a lot of concern given to that. As I said, we talk a lot about embryos being given over to research. And that's very, very little difference between that and giving over your infant child to the medical industry for research and tearing that child apart and using different cells from that child. The research just happens to be that the children in this case are very, very young. So maybe being 3 days old, 5 days old is again a much more dangerous place to be than being 8 months in utero. I mean, clearly it is. Right? We know that public opinion varies, and the majority of the American public supports unlimited abortion in the early stages of pregnancy, as the majority of public supports restrictions on abortion later in pregnancy. And there's a lot of different studies and a lot of different ways to cut that. But we're trying here to illustrate that there's the humanity of the embryo is equal to my humanity or your humanity. We're just a lot older. So thank you again. I'll be happy to address any questions. And this is a picture of the couple with the oldest mother that had undergone IVF in India. And before we say, well, India is a very unregulated medical industry, as is China sometimes, as I said, the United States, it is pretty equally unregulated. You could do this today in California without any risk of legal repercussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Michescu, for that excellent presentation. And now we will entertain questions from our participants. Our Q&A moderator, Francis Etheridge, is a Catholic married layman with 11 children, 3 of whom he hopes are in heaven, and the rest of whom are alive and well and stepping through life stages of school, university, and career. In the last 7 years, he has returned to being a self-employed writer, adding 12 books to his list of publications. Francis is the author of several books on the question of the beginning of each one of us, a number of which have been published by En route Books and Media. These include The Human Person, a Bioethical Word, Conception, an Icon of the Beginning, Mary and Bioethics, an Exploration, Unfolding a Post-Roe World, and Reaching for the Resurrection, a Pastoral Bioethics. Coming soon is his new book, Human Nature, Moral Norm. Francis, it's all yours.
And thank you, Dr. Rex and Dr. Michescu. And I apologize for any mispronunciation.
Okay.
To begin with, we have a question about the dissemination of this excellent seminar. So I'll read what Sister Agnes has said. I am astounded there are not more on this seminar, but I believe it is because of how well this has been hidden from the educators. Is this recording going to be available so as to spread it? Yes. The detail you have given would stop the immoral conception of children. It is a growing issue among same-sex couples. So can you address the wider dearth of this kind of presentation? How can it be got further afield? Dr. X. Rex.
Thank you, Francis. I'm trying my best, and I'm very grateful Sebastian will be publishing my first book, I hope by as early as next week, a handbook on the moral arguments in the embryo adoption debate. And I'm very grateful that ITEST has already done a webinar on that topic. There are definitely pros and cons that since, Donum Vitae, and especially since Dignitas Personae 2008, these documents have pros and cons in them. And the Vatican did not prohibit the practice. They have left this issue open. Unfortunately, it's a very complicated topic, not unlike artificial contraception. There's a lot of debate over that issue back in prior to 1968 and Humanae Vitae. And if you heard anything, you probably heard that contraception, the birth control pill, should be approved by the church. So now we have this artificial fertilization issue since 1987, and especially since 2008. And you hear a lot of voices, unfortunately, because IVF is evil. but embryo transfer is licit. So there are a lot of people who have just lumped, you throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I'm trying to say, let's save the baby from the bathwater. That the church has actually, if you take a very close look, like I hope I explained today, that when you look at the documents, they're trying to save the baby while condemning the artificial fertilization. So I'm hoping that as this webinar will be recorded and be available, we can promote it. And I think Sebastian might even have the book up on his website at En Route Books and Media. It's called A Handbook on the Moral Arguments of the Embryo Adoption Debate. And it includes Donum Vitae and Dignitas Personae in the back, along with glossaries from both documents. So I recommend that readers inform themselves, because you can't really find this information out there. It is available in the documents, but it was so many years ago, 1987, which was before embryo adoption. The first frozen embryo to be adopted wasn't until 1998, 12 years later. And so you'd have to do a little digging, but now we have more resources as more people are speaking up on behalf of the unborn child. The baby should be saved and IVF should be prohibited, but people are desperate for children. And unfortunately, most unwanted pregnancies are aborted. They don't choose adoption. And so there's no babies to adopt. And so they go to IVF. And then there are all these extra frozen embryos. But if we ban cryopreservation, I hope that's a big takeaway, that these laws in Germany and Italy have banned cryopreservation. You can't make more embryos than you're going to transfer. I know that's a compromise for those of us who are Catholic, but the Vatican saw there's incremental laws. And of course, Catholics should never do it, no matter what. But for those who are not Catholic, it puts regulations on the IVF industry. So I would say we need to protect the Embryo Protection Act, and then regulate IVF and realize that embryos can be adopted. It's an earlier adoption. They've been abandoned. They are orphans, and adoption is a good thing. Keeping them frozen is a bad thing. And if you keep paying your cryopreservation fees, you're supporting the fertility industry. If you adopt these little embryos, then guess what? People won't go to IVF. If they can adopt frozen embryos, why do IVF? You can adopt these abandoned children. And the church has always praised adoption for abandoned children. 2379 in the Catechism, you can look it up. So it's just at an earlier stage.
And I think frequently, Francis, we find ourselves preaching to the choir, right? We all on this webinar are interested in these topics, and we all would love for Barnes and Noble to have our writings and these topics as bestsellers. But again, we're not really reaching the audience. That's the motivation behind the creation of the new medical school in Kansas, because while we can talk about this school will graduate up to 180 faithful Catholic physicians a year, or physicians in the Catholic framework, who will understand these issues. I mean, a lot of times physicians just don't receive this sort of training or this perspective in medical school. It reminds me of when my wife was pregnant with our third child, and she was a little bit older, and the obstetrician said, well, we can schedule an amniocentesis on such and such date. And our response was, why? And until that moment, he didn't realize that, again, if you're not going to do anything with the results, right? If you're not going to abort a child that has a genetic anomaly, why would you do this test? But he had never considered it from that perspective. It was like explaining oxygen to somebody who grew up on the moon. And that's the thing about a lot of physicians. They never even experienced this perspective of a fertilized ovum as a human life. It's never laid out like that in medical school. So it becomes an afterthought or something that just they back into when they get interested in biomedical ethics at some time in the future. But a lot of times they just run right over it and don't even think about that. So that's our motivation behind creating really the only medical school that will look at these sorts of ethical issues in detail during training. So it'll be on top of their mind. We hope that every student will graduate with both a medical degree and a master's degree in Catholic biomedical ethics and medical theology. So they'll be thought leaders in the discipline. And that's one way that we're looking at this.
Thank you. We move on. There is a question about the document Dignitas Personae. I hope there is a document available that can be read, but if I read the question and we take it from there and see what can be done. I don't have a copy of Dignitas Personae in front of me, but I recall that your quote from it, praising prenatal adoption, begins with although and ends with a warning that it has moral issues as well. Please, could you read the whole sentence for clarification?
I have the book here, and the person is correct. But let me just say, the church did not condemn prenatal adoption. It gives warnings. It is true. But it also praises prenatal adoption for saving these and rescuing these children. So often you'll hear people just focus on the negative. I may have focused on the positive, but it's true. Just like with any adoption, wouldn't it be better if the baby could be raised by its own mother and father? Of course. Are there medical, psychological problems, legal problems? Yes, there are with adoption. There are also those kind of problems with your own natural children. Lots of problems. But there's no moral problems. Dr. William May pointed that out. So it is not IVF. It is not insemination. It is not surrogacy. So while IVF is unacceptable, immoral, ET, embryo transfer, is licit and must be considered licit to heal and save the life of the baby. And I think that's what it's been confusing. I even spoke with Dr. Monsignor William Smith. Many of you know of him, a great moral theologian who's passed away many years ago, but I was in his parish, and I was working at the seminary where he taught moral theology for many years. And I wanted to speak with him because he called it a slippery slope, but you can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that's why the church left it open for discussion, just as contraception was controversial. And there was a lot of discussion back and forth until Paul VI wrote Humanae Vitae, and one of his great collaborators was Pope John Paul II. So it was countercultural. He was called a heretic. Humanae Vitae was banned from seminaries. It caused a lot of problems within the Catholic Church. A lot of Catholic theologians and priests and bishops all said the Pope's made a mistake, but he didn't. And the Holy Spirit guided the church. And that's why there's this debate today and these webinars. We need to inform ourselves. What does the Catholic Church teach? And I hope that you will read Donum Vitae and read Dignitas Personae. And I would recommend that you read it from the dignity of the child, the dignity of the human person. No matter what, the child's life is primary, central. And that's the message of Theology of the Body, of John Paul II, of Benedict and Pope Francis, is that the dignity of the human person is above all. And children are abused badly by their biological parents. And that's where the evil is. They should not be doing IVF. But once it's been done, the child needs to be accepted and raised within love. And if the natural parents don't want it, then let the child be adopted. So it does talk about, if you want me, I can read it, but it is, Francis, shall I take just a little moment here? The phrase is, it's under 19, and it says, it has also been proposed solely in order to allow human beings to be born who are otherwise condemned to destruction, that there could be a form of prenatal adoption. This proposal, praiseworthy with regard to the intention of respecting and defending human life, presents, however, various problems not dissimilar to those mentioned above. All things considered, it needs to be recognized that thousands of abandoned embryos represent a situation of injustice, which in fact cannot be resolved. Therefore, John Paul II made an appeal to the conscience of the world's scientific authorities, and in particular to doctors, that the production of human embryos be halted, taking into account that there seems to be no morally licit solution regarding the human destiny of the thousands and thousands of frozen embryos which are and remain the subjects of essential rights and should therefore be protected by law as human persons. And I focused on seems. They're looking for a moral licit solution. And embryo transfer is a moral licit procedure that can save their lives. And adoption is a praiseworthy intention for anyone, married, fertile, infertile, adoption. There should be no children in foster care. We Christians, we Catholics need to open our hearts and our homes to, it's a work of mercy. So that's why it's being debated, and there are two sides to this debate. And I hope you look at our book, a handbook on the moral arguments in the embryo adoption debate.
Thank
And
you.
I would like to see a pro-life state like Oklahoma simply make IVF illegal because of these multiple layers of issues that occur. I don't see that happening necessarily, but maybe in one of the more strong pro-life states. Again, Oklahoma is a standout and not really a big competitor to California in the industry, but that would at least be a marker for other states and bring this situation to discussion in the forefront. We're also talking to one of the senators from Mississippi as well because of their pro-life inclinations to at least put a pause or a prohibition on this, because we'll just continue creating millions of children and waiting for them in liquid nitrogen. The problem is not going away.
I would add to that by banning cryopreservation, that could be passed in pro-life states with broad support. It protects the lives of the embryos. They cannot be harmed or killed, or there will be penalties and fines. So you can't freeze them. You just stop the cryopreservation and you regulate the IVF. It's not perfect, but it limits it to 3. Only married couples, no pre-implantation diagnosis, so you don't do eugenics. There's no pregnancy reduction, and you can only do it once. I didn't read the full law, but the law in Italy absolutely shuts down IVF, almost totally. And that's why they wanted to have a referendum to overturn it. And the Vatican came out, and from the pulpits, were telling people not to vote because they needed 50% plus 1. And it survived. The Vatican supported the law in Italy. It's not perfect, but is much better than just being totally unregulated, unbridled, cryopreservation. And then they banned cryopreservation, and they said the embryos could be adopted. And so eventually there'll be no more frozen embryos in Italy. And there are no more frozen embryos, I don't think, in Germany, because they shut down, they passed that Embryo Protection Act. That could be a law that could be passed easily in all 50 states that are pro-life. Just protect the embryo. You cannot harm it or kill it, and you can't freeze it. It's
Okay,
doable.
thank you, Dr. Rex. Returning to the question of medical education, particularly from a Catholic point of view, this question is for you, Dr. Nicoscu. First, a Catholic IVF doctor told me that not all fertilized eggs are embryos. I always thought the church teaches they are embryos, i.e. a new, unique human being from the moment of conception. Please, could you clarify this for me, Dr. George?
Thank you, Francis. I think that particular physician is getting lost in the syntax. As I said, embryo is defined in some sources as a unborn child at a certain age of gestation. So you frequently see folks that dabble in euphemisms use the ZEF, which I think is an abominable term for a human being, but they use zygote, embryo, fetus, and they abbreviate that ZEF to stand for an unborn child. So this physician is getting lost in the labels. It doesn't really matter if you call it an embryo, a zygote, a fetus, a clump of cells. You use whatever euphemism makes you comfortable, but at the end of the day, at the moment of fertilization, it is a unique, living human being until the moment of natural death. And if you call it an embryo or a zygote or a blastocyst, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't change the fundamental worthy humanity of that unborn child. And that's the important thing to understand. The label is what's used by, as I call them, the pro-abortion cheerleaders, to make people forget that we're dealing with an unborn human life. It's easier to call it something else. Just like the Nazis called the extermination of the Jews special handling. Euphemisms are used to hide honest discussions, and that's what's going on. And this physician is simply confused because medical school, again, don't really teach bioethical issues. They simply put labels on things that somebody has to memorize to pass a test. So that's what we see here.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Rex, would you like to come in briefly on this? Because we have a lot of new questions.
Yes, just briefly. Now, this is the first anniversary of Dobbs. I'd like to say that Hannah Strigi, the world's first adopted frozen embryo, who's 24 years old, submitted an amicus brief to the Supreme Court. She was helped by the Justice Foundation. And this amicus brief said, I am living proof that I was viable at conception. I was viable while I was frozen for 2 years. Here I am. And she asked to argue 5 minutes before the court. It was a great strategy because then all 9 Supreme Court justices had to read her amicus brief to deny her, but they read it. And that's absolutely true. These little frozen embryos are proof that these children are persons, not property. And they can speak for themselves now. So I would encourage everyone also to use new terminology instead of promoting life for children in the womb. We need to use the term maybe unborn children, because we can't forget millions of frozen embryos that have a right to life. They too are persons, not property. And I predict that these frozen embryos, a lot of these cases where there's a divorce and it's, who gets to keep the babies or who destroys the frozen embryos, will go to the Supreme Court. Because if it's a divorce, you divide property, but children are custody. And are they persons or are they property? And the 14th Amendment protects persons who are not property. So these little embryos are very important, and the other side knows that. So there are a lot of people who are fighting very hard to call these frozen embryos not persons. And I would encourage, I think there's a great time to proclaim ensoulment and personhood for the Catholic Church at this moment. Because we know that Mary was ensouled at the first instant. She was a person at the first instant of her Immaculate Conception. And what's true for her is true for us. And it's true for Jesus. Jesus has a human soul. Body, blood, soul, and divinity. He has a human soul and a human body. His soul was created by the Holy Spirit. So we can use our Catholic faith to defend every single person, as Dr. Machowski said, from conception till death. But let's use unborn children so that we are inclusive and include frozen embryos as well.
You're muted.
Thank you, Dr. X. Would you talk a bit about your upcoming book? This is another follow-on, please.
Oh, yes, quickly. I'm very grateful for that first ITEST webinar, but it was between myself and a Dr. Charles Robertson. And Charles Robertson and I have been going back and forth, debating each other professionally, ethically. He's in the pages of the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly since 2014. So I wrote an article, he responded with an article. I wrote back to his article, he responded to my article. So we were going back and forth until, for many years. And we found common ground. It was fascinating. And so this book will include all of the articles that were published in the National Catholic Bioethics Center. We have permission from the NCBC to do that with a little foreword, we hope, from the editor. And then it will include the transcript from the webinar with ITEST, where we go face-to-face, toe-to-toe, and then questions and answers and all of that good stuff. And so I think it'll be fascinating to see the arguments on both sides. And Dr. Robertson I think his doctorate was advised by Father Tad Pacholczyk. Many of you might know him. He's the Director of Education at NCBC. He's very opposed to embryo adoption. Charles Robert they call embryo transfer intrinsically evil. I call it licit, morally licit. So what does the Catholic Church say? And let's look at what the Church is saying through the Holy Spirit. But unless we read these documents, it's just our personal opinions. So I encourage people to read the original magisterial documents, and there'll be glossaries. There are terms like heterologous, homologous. You need to know what those things mean. It's, it's not that complicated, but it's such an important issue. And this book could be used in classrooms because it's meant to be a handbook that people could see for themselves. We report, you decide. And so it could be useful in a classroom or discussing things with friends, or if they don't know what the Catholic Church teaches. We're trying to keep it affordable and small, so paperback. And there's a discount. I think as Sebastian said, those who order it today or recently, 30% off. It's a pre-publication offer. So I hope you'll find it interesting to see, and we're trying to be as fair as possible, allowing each one of us to have our full say. And then I hope it'll clarify what the Church is teaching and what the moral solution will be. I hope it will be in favor of the child and embryo adoption, which is a good choice for an unplanned pregnancy or an unwanted child or abused child, endangered child. Adoption is a great solution for all unwanted children, not abortion. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rex, and therefore a natural implication for you, Dr. Mikustu, that this could be available for you and your work. But also I will field the next question to you, Dr. George. Wouldn't you need to utilize IVF to transfer a prenatal adopted embryo?
Well, it depends on what you mean by IVF. You would have to use some of the technologies that are employed in the practice or the industry of IVF to transfer and implant an embryo, correct? But you would not create more embryos in the process. It's simply taking an embryo and implanting that embryo into a uterus using very similar technologies and using obviously practitioners that are in the IVF industry skilled at that. So it is a little bit of a two-edged sword, right? But you're not creating new embryos in the process. You're simply utilizing technology that exists and skills of practitioners who are in the industry.
Thank you.
If I just might add to that, IVF is completely immoral. And usually these are spare embryos that have been frozen. Okay, so IVF has been done and over. And now embryo transfer is a medical intervention to save the life of the embryo. And that, the church has said, must be considered licit. And it's a very simple procedure. They just thaw. The embryos are stored in a straw that's been frozen in liquid nitrogen up to 30 years. Who knows, they could be 40, 50 years frozen. You just thaw them and transfer all of them right into the womb, right from the straw, I believe. No, nothing special. And just see if they can implant or not. And some will and some won't. Hannah was one of 20. Her mother and father adopted 20 leftover frozen embryos from a couple who wanted them to be adopted and not destroyed. They did not do IVF. They did not want to do IVF. They did want to bring a child, adopt a child, and love it within their families. So 19 of them didn't make it. Cryopreservation is brutal, the freezing and the thawing, but every child deserves the chance to implant itself. A doctor cannot implant an embryo. The embryo has to implant itself. If it's been harmed and its physical integrity is damaged, you won't implant. But if it's okay, it's got a chance. And Hannah was the only one out of the 20. She gave names to all of her siblings who didn't make it. So, we have to look at all those kinds of considerations. IVF is totally evil. It should be shut down. And those of us who are Catholic can maybe hope for someday that it will be. But just like abortion, whoever thought that we would overturn Roe v. Wade, but we did. So I think these little embryos that have been adopted are very glad that they're not stuck in some frozen canister somewhere. The concentration can, as Jerome Lejeune called them, and that we can heal them and save them and even cure them. Some of these embryos might be able to be cured of cystic fibrosis and even Down syndrome. That was the goal of Dr. Jerome Lejeune, that there could be a gene therapy that is therapeutic for the embryo to heal it from these genetic or inherited diseases. That's why I think if we consider the human embryo as a human patient, we would love to heal those embryos. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mikustu, if we call you in again on the possibility of aiding an ectopic pregnancy, there is a Dr. Stephen Samut at the Franciscan University of Steubenville who's working on this. It clearly doesn't have the profitability of IVF. Would you like to comment on the possible help to a child conceived ectopically out, so it's embedding in the fallopian tube.
Yes, no, thank you. And Stephen Smith at Franciscan is doing great work. I might add, he's a wonderful researcher. That being said, I think we always in medicine look to protect and preserve life. So if there was a method by which an ectopic child could be rescued from the fallopian tube and implanted into the uterus for gestation, I think everyone would, strongly support that. The issue is that technology does not exist right now. Now, everything that we can conceive of probably will exist at some point in the future. It's not a high priority for a lot of researchers because it's simply cheaper and easier to discard that child and come again next time, right? A lot of ectopics occur, and the ectopics are treated. The woman is treated, the child dies, and these women subsequently become pregnant successfully. Money drives a lot of decision making in medicine, and it's not just limited to ectopics. There's a lot of money in decision making given end of life issues as well. However, pregnancy is unique in that it can happen again many times, most times. So that has not driven a large research agenda. But that being said, if there was a way to either implant that child into the uterus or rescue that child and raise that child to viability, that I think would be important in the medical community. Just getting them, again, it's the whole equation of is it worth it to research? And again, we're touching now on the concept of artificial wombs, and I realize that is ethically challenging. However, if there was, instead of using the term artificial womb, a very sophisticated neonatal isolate that could take an ectopic at 13 weeks and bring the child to be able to be released from the hospital at 40 weeks or 60 weeks post-conceptual age, there's very little difference between that isolate and what we use for 24-week infants right now. It's just a much more sophisticated device, again, which does not exist, right? People talk about artificial wombs, and there's some very clever YouTube videos used by people trying to raise private equity for investment and make artificial wombs for more nefarious reasons. Yeah. But at the end of the day, an artificial womb, if you want to use that term, to gestate or to complete the gestation of a rescued ectopic there's very little difference between that and a neonatal isolate if it's used for that purpose. But like everything in technology, there's all kinds of nefarious uses people will find for it.
Thank you. Dr. Rex, do you want to comment briefly on that? And then we'll go to our last question.
Yes, just briefly. I know someone, Thomas Cremona, Dr. Thomas Cremona, who has done his master's thesis on ectopic pregnancies and did full research. And apparently there has been one case. It was a long time ago in the early 1900s where someone was trying to get pregnant and she had fibroids. The doctor went in to remove the fibroids and saw that there was an ectopic pregnancy. So without even asking her, he was able to take the tiny embryo from the fallopian tube, I guess with a little tiny bit of tissue from the fallopian tube, already implanted, and he had just removed a fibroid. So there was an open wound in the uterus, and he stitched it, 1 or 2 little stitches, and the baby was born. It managed to gestate and be born naturally. Now, I don't I'm not the expert on that, but it makes sense to me that that could be done. And why not? Because I think what Donum Vitae is saying is that the hypothesis, even to plan for an artificial womb, is contrary to the dignity of the child.
Thank
So
you,
if-
Dr. Rex. I'm
Yeah.
sorry I have to come in there. We're
That's
practically
okay.
at our time. But on that good note of a child being saved, I return us to Dr. Sebastian Mahfood.
This wraps up our Q&A. A special thank you to Francis Etheridge for leading us in the Q&A session, and to everyone who joined us for your participation in this webinar. Thank you especially to Dr. Elizabeth Rex and to Dr. George Michescu for their excellent presentations. In conclusion, our closing prayer will be led by Julie Butler. Julie has an MA in Theology from Holy Apostles College and Seminary and is working on her doctorate in theology at Pontifex University. Julie?
O merciful God, please grant us your grace, and may it remain with us always and persevere in us to the end. Please grant that we may always will and desire whatever is most pleasing and acceptable to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.